I call addiction a liar. Everyone who comes into recovery has got a whole bunch of consequences about, what's happened out there in active addiction. If a banana put me in hospital, I'm never ever eating another banana. But with addiction, there's a little sneaky voice in your head that says, maybe if you go back to it, it will be different this time. So, this idea that I've got a little bit of me that's telling me bullshit is very, very easy to recognize. But when the lies aren't hugely obvious, like just one won't hurt, it's very easy to kind of dismiss them as just kind of, it's part of who I am and it's just kind of normal thinking. I can very much pinpoint now 3 distinct areas where my addiction loves to have a field day. The first batch of lies that I'm going to talk about are going to be around self-pity. Then we're going to look at fear. And then finally, we're going to look at anger. All right, so let's look at self-pity straight off the bat. Welcome to School of Rock Bottom with Oliver Mason. I'm an actor, a voiceover artist and recovery coach who's been sober 9 years, and I know firsthand that rock bottom can be the greatest teacher and the springboard for a beautiful life. And as you know, I interview fellow creatives and all inspiring people that have hit rock bottom, survived and thrived. This is a podcast of hope and how to get out of the darkness into the light. And I'm very excited today because I am interviewing no one. Actually, if you guys remember episode 22, the 12 basic lies of addiction, this is another special. This is a follow-up from that episode, really tailored to those that listen to this podcast or watch this podcast that are actually in recovery themselves. So if you've not watched episode or listened to episode 22, please go back. It's called the 12 basic lies of addiction, and remind yourself there about why I call addiction a liar. What we're actually going to be doing today is going a little bit beneath the surface, going beyond the kind of obvious lies that addiction loves to tell us in recovery. So the classic ones being you don't have a problem, or there is a problem, the problem won't go away, or you are your addiction. It will be different this time. Just one won't hurt, yada, yada, yada. Again, go back to that episode if you've forgotten and remind yourself. We're actually going to go deeper today at the kind of lies that aren't as obvious, the ones that are a little bit more sneaky, ones that maybe we don't blame on addiction, but I very much do in my own recovery. I very much kind of call it out and go, that's my addiction telling me bullshit again. The reason why I call addiction a lie, I mean, there's a lot of science around it. And if you go back to lie 4 in episode 22, I go into a lot of detail about how this happens. But essentially, everyone who comes into recovery has got a whole bunch of consequences about, what's happened out there in active addiction. If a banana put me in hospital, I'm never ever eating another banana. But with addiction, there's a little sneaky voice in your head that says, maybe if you go back to it, it will be different this time. So, this idea that I've got a little bit of me that's telling me bullshit is very, very easy to recognize. But when the lies aren't hugely obvious, like just one won't hurt, it's very easy to kind of dismiss them as just kind of, it's part of who I am and it's just kind of normal thinking. But I can very much pinpoint now 3 distinct areas where my addiction loves to have a field day. And I'm so grateful today that, being in recovery a little while, I find it very easy to navigate these lies, but particularly in the first year or two, I found these incredibly difficult. So the first batch of lies that I'm going to talk about are going to be around self-pity. Then we're going to look at fear. And then finally, we're going to look at anger. All right, so let's look at self-pity straight off the bat. So if you look at the English dictionary around self-pity, you're going to find lots of different definitions. In recovery, it has a very specific definition. So it's a verb. It's not sadness. It's not depression. Obviously, those things are very serious, particularly depression, for example, clinical depression. That's obviously a serious medical condition. What we're talking about, though, with self-pity in the context of recovery is it's a verb. So it's a doing word. It's an action, and it's you actively beating the crap out of yourself. Now, for me, drinking is very much an act of self-harm, but a lot of the self-harm actually goes on internally. It goes on within the mind. The way that I used to speak to myself in active addiction and in early recovery, if I was speaking to a friend like that, I would have no friends. I mean, it was an absolute assassination. Um, I used to look in the mirror and call myself literally every single name under the sun. I just looked in the mirror and just thought, this person I'm looking at is absolute filth. I thought I was absolutely vile. And a lot of that, beating myself up and that self pity caused a lot of relapses back in the day because I just couldn't sit with that pain with who I'd actually become. And that then sparked another drink, which then meant I then became powerless again over my consumption. That then meant I became powerless over how long I was drinking. That then meant I became powerless over my behavior, my mood, and my mental health. And then because I couldn't deal with the fallout of all of that, I went back into self pity again, and round and round it went. So, what we start to realize is that self pity is a huge component in that wheel of addiction. And so, therefore, in recovery, we have to find a way to pluck it out. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break down 3 basic lies around self pity. Here's lie 1. Lie 1 is you are scum and don't deserve recovery or happiness or whatever word you want to choose. I think a lot of people in early recovery feel like that. That, okay, great, there's this amazing thing called recovery. Maybe you're in a rehab, maybe you're in a meeting, in a therapy room, and people are talking about the joys of recovery and how great it is to be sober, particularly at the moment. Everyone seems to be talking about how amazing that is. It wasn't like that 10 years ago. Um, and you think, okay, well, that's great. I really want to get on board with that. But then there's this little nagging voice in your head that says, well, that doesn't apply to you because the stuff that you've done is so horrific, so horrendous that you don't deserve that. You don't have access to that. And that's how wicked addiction is because it makes us powerless over our behavior. Everybody's coming into recovery with a whole bunch of consequences. Like, I've never ever worked with anyone in say a rehab or an early recovery who, you say to them, how's things with your wife? And they're like, oh, well, actually, she thinks I'm a dreamboat, or, how are things going at your job? And, they take out their phone. They're like, here we go. There's me on my Instagram wall being employee of the month for a whole year. Everyone's got the same story. I'm on my last chance. The business is folding. Um, Everybody is coming in hugely in the doghouse. And particularly if you follow like a 12-step program, you might then be, say, writing out your step 1, looking at all the examples of while you're powerless or all your unmanageability. And there's addiction going, see, there you go. There's the proof. I told you that you're a scumbag and now you've got the proof. And remember, step 1 or any kind of work that you might do around trying to get some clarity around your addiction, that is simply just proof that your life is unmanageable or that you're powerless over drugs and alcohol. It's not proof that you are a scumbag. But you see, that's what addiction likes to do. It likes to kind of hijack a tool that we have in our recovery and sort of make it evidence that something isn't real so that we can therefore justify a drink or a drug or a behavior or whatever that is. And I think a lot of people in early recovery can understand that, say, powerless means, okay, if I have 1 drink, I don't know if I'm going to have 1 or if I'm going to have 10. I don't know if I'm going to drink for just Friday night or whether it'll be all weekend or maybe it'll spill into the week. But you can't say, okay, well, that's true. I understand that I'm powerless over my consumption, but then at the same time say, well, that also means that I'm going to control my behavior. If you're powerless over consumption, you immediately become powerless over your behavior. You can't separate the two. You might do. You might say, I don't want it to be that way, but, excuse my language, it's kind of tough shit. That is the way that addiction presents itself, and wanting it to be any other way is a little bit like getting the flu and complaining that, you've got a fever with it. If you get the flu, you're going to get a fever. You might not like it. You might want to take the fever out of it, but that is what it does. And that's what addiction does as well. It means that you're not sure how many drinks you're gonna have or drugs you're gonna have or whatever the behavior might be or whatever else. But also that means you're not quite sure what your behavior is gonna be like. And so that is the reason why you come in with those consequences and that behavior. It's not because you're a scumbag or a horrible person. It's because you're powerless over drugs and alcohol or processes or behaviors. And that's the bit that's really difficult to separate. But it then begs the question, how do you forgive yourself for that? And I'm not gonna lie, I can't kind of like wrap it up in a lovely tidy bow in a podcast and say, "Right, I'm gonna, make it that you forgive yourself in this moment." But what I would love to do is start to sort of encourage you how you might be able to start to do that. And I think for me, the first thing was really understanding the mechanisms of addiction and how it affects human beings. You cannot escape the powerlessness over your behavior. I think that's number one. Number two is, for me, the most important word in my recovery is the first word of step one, which is we. So this idea that I can't, but we can. And whether you're part of a 12-step community or whether you're part of Smart Recovery or, whether you're part of Sober Dave's Thursday night Zoom, it really doesn't matter. But this idea of connection, I think is so, so important. And I've never, ever met yet a single person in recovery that if they are telling their story and maybe they're breaking down or they're upset about the consequences that they've gone through with their addiction, I've never once heard anyone turn around and go, "You're a disgrace. You're disgusting. That's horrible. Get out of the room." The first thing that we do, literally every time, is we go straight into empathy and we give that person a hug. And really, if you think about it, you giving that person a hug is really you giving yourself a hug, because what they've gone through, you've gone through, because your stuff is really their stuff. And to be honest, you can't really authentically go up to somebody else and say, "I love you, man. It's going to be all right." If you haven't extended that love and empathy and forgiveness to yourself, you're kind of full of shit, really. Just being blunt. You're putting on a slight act, I think, because their stuff is your stuff. Um, so I think one way to forgive yourself is through other humans within the recovery community, by realizing that by forgiving them, you've forgiven yourself. And maybe if you've got a spiritual part of your life, or a religious part of your life, which I know some people do. I remember I was helping someone out quite early on in recovery, and I was really struggling with this guy because he wouldn't forgive himself. And I didn't really know what to say to him, but I knew that he was very religious. So I actually ended up speaking to a vicar in recovery, and I was trying to work out like how I could help him. And we went out for a coffee, and I sat down with him and I just asked him a simple question. I said, "Has God forgiven you?" And immediately he went, "Well, of course God has forgiven me. God is forgiveness." And in that moment, he was able to do it. He was able to access it. Um, And I think I then went and said, "Well, isn't it arrogant then not to forgive yourself? Shouldn't you be in line with God and forgive yourself too?" Or something else that the vicar had told me to write down. And he actually started to cry. Excuse me. And I didn't really understand what I'd said to him, but it seemed to open a door to that possibility. Because I think addiction knows that if we don't forgive ourselves, if we stay in that self-pity loop, it's probably just a matter of time before we pick up a drug or a drink, because it just becomes too painful. And I'll never forget being in rehab, and it was just absolutely brutal because I'd sort of be, I'd be at breakfast or something like that, and having a real belly laugh. I mean, I think it's amazing when you laugh because you're kind of, like a proper belly laugh, because you're not living in the future, worrying in anxiety, and you're not in the past, depressed and thinking about all of that. It really forces you into the moment. But as soon as addiction was kind of there, like banging on my shoulder, going, "Hang on a minute, you can't laugh. You're a scumbag. Have you not forgotten about all the horrible things you've done?" And I would just be tormented. And I remember just thinking, I don't know how I'll ever get sober, because I'm just constantly ruminating about all this crap that I'd done and not done. Sometimes it's the things that we haven't done. And if we go back to that lie again, you are scum and don't deserve recovery. I mean, that second bit is an absolute mug off. I mean, nobody, and I'm going to talk directly to you right now, nobody deserves recovery more than you do. Whoever it is that I'm talking about, I would not wish addiction on my worst enemy. It is a horrific thing to go through, the dark night of the soul, being sat there at 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, staring at the ceiling, covered in sweat, wondering if you're going to get out of it. Like, you have suffered enough, you know? Um, if there is any pain and suffering that is due, you've already suffered it. And the thing is, if you say to somebody that's really in the depths of self-pity, like, how long, let's say that we're going to put you in the stocks and we're going to kind of chuck rotten fruit at you like they used to do in the old days. How long should we chuck the rotten fruit at you? The person that's in self-pity can't give you a sell-by date. No one's going to turn around and say, well, actually, I think you should throw rotten fruit at me for the next 2 weeks, 2 days, 2 hours, and 22 minutes. Like, the forgiveness and the self-pity starts and ends when we say it ends, or whenever it starts, the forgiveness, that is. Nobody can choose it for us. And so I really, really encourage, if you're listening to this in suffering, to really start to sort of move into that, because we all deserve it. Everybody comes in with baggage. And I'm going to say something that might sound a little bit harsh. If you're in early recovery, it's completely normal not to be able to forgive yourself. But, if you're finding yourself sort of months, years down the road, still in that self-pity around the things that you've done, and unable to kind of get to that place of forgiveness and self-acceptance, I think it's the same reason that people don't delete their drug dealer's number. What is that about? And I believe it's about an insurance to relapse. That's what I think it's about. It's about, well, if I can just hold that little bit of self-pity back and not forgive myself, then I've got a great excuse to pick up or use in the future. Now, that might sound really harsh to some people listening to that, but I guarantee you, once you start to unpick all of this stuff, it starts to become quite obvious. The second lie I want to talk about around self-pity is quite simple. Life is shit. What's the point? So I'm just going to say that one again. Life is shit. What's the point? Now, some people get this thought, well, most people, if not everybody, gets this in active addiction. Some people get it in recovery as well. And it might come as a surprise, particularly those people that actually know me quite well, that I can actually get this in recovery when I'm not using anything and I'm completely clean and sober. The difference today is when the thought comes in is I don't believe it, because I don't see myself as my thoughts at all. I see myself as the awareness of my thoughts as opposed to the thoughts themselves. And I think having that gap is a real game changer. It's a little bit like being in Old Trafford or something like that. Don't know if you remember when they were trying to get the Glazers out, or they still are, I think. There was a plane that used to go over the top of Old Trafford that said Glazers out. Nobody sat in that stadium is like, I'm that banner. That's me. You're the observer of that banner. And so, the way I look at my brain is, I think the human brain has 88,000 thoughts on average a day. I mean, I don't know who sat down and worked that out. But if all of those were put on paper, and someone read them, they'd probably think I was absolutely nuts. And I've learned over the years that, my brain just loves to have a chatter. It just loves to have a little chat. So today when the thought comes in, for me, it's just my brain having a thought. It doesn't mean a huge lot. But in early recovery, it meant everything. It meant, oh, wow, I've thought this thing, therefore this is the reality. Whereas now a thought like that can come in, and recovery gives me the opportunity to then challenge that thought. Because even now, I don't feel that I have complete control over my thoughts, but I do have complete control how I react to them, if that makes any sense. Um, I'll give you another example. So 90% of people, when they're standing on the train platform and a train is about to come in, 90% of people have this thought: what about if I just jumped in front of this train? Right? But the difference is most people after that thought kind of go, that was random. I wonder why I just thought that. And then they move on to something else, like, I wonder if I'm going to have sausages for tea or something like that. What I used to do is I used to massively overthink that. So I'd have that thought and then I'd get on the train and then I'd go on Google and I'd be self-diagnosing, going, oh my God, why have I just thought that? What does that mean? Maybe I'm suicidal. Maybe I'm mentally ill, and I'd sort of spiral in this kind of anxiety spiral, um, and massively overthink it. So me and lots of other people have had the same thought, but my reaction to that thought has been completely different, which really, really proves to me that the way that you react to thoughts is where your power is. So addiction says, life is shit. What's the point? Recovery says, I think life can be shit. I think it's important to acknowledge that we can have bad days and life can be really difficult. But then it says, find the point, as opposed to, you know, keep wallowing and ruminating and making it bigger. I'll never forget in early recovery, I had a bit of a mentor and I rang him up and I said to him, life is shit. What's the point? And I actually thought he was going to have a bit of a pity party with me, sort of rub my belly and say, oh, what's wrong? Tell me all about it. And actually what he did was he said, that gratitude list that I've been telling you to write? He said, I want you to go back to that list. He said, and I want you to find something on that list that proves what you just said is bullshit. And I went back to that list and here's the thing. Secretly, I wanted to be right. I wanted to look at that gratitude list and absolutely find nothing that gave my life a point. But there I am going back to this gratitude list I absolutely hated writing. I couldn't see any point in it. I thought it was a load of old rubbish. I wrote down, spend some time with my godson and watched a movie. And I thought, wow. Yeah, there's a point to that. Yeah, there's a point to that. I'm someone's godfather. Do you know what I mean? I've got someone in my life, a young person in my life that looks up to me. That immediately has given me a purpose to my life, a point to my life. Anyone that's got young people in their life, or it's nieces, nephews, grandkids, children, like, you are someone's hero. And yes, depending on when you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast, if you're in the throes of addiction, you might think, well, I'm a terrible example, but that isn't the case, because now is your chance to rewrite history. Um, you could be the person that, they turn around and say, my uncle, he really, really suffered with addiction. He was really unwell, but he beat it. He turned his life around and then he went and helped other people. This is a hero story. I think the story that we tell ourselves in recovery is 99% of it. Going from that kind of victim mentality, which I lived in for such a long time, everything's going wrong, nothing works out. That's the kind of story that addiction tells you, right? Because you're powerless, things are always turning to shit. And then recovery turns up and says, well, actually, if you put the work in and you actually do the next right thing, things will start to work out. And you think, well, that's not the evidence of what I've had before. The evidence that I've had before has been that everything's turned terrible. And so actually, when the opposite starts to happen, you really start to see, well, actually, okay, yeah, maybe things can start to work out. And when I went back to that gratitude list, I found all of these things that only happened because I was sober. And so that gratitude list then became proof that my life does have a point, and it also became proof that recovery is working. And I got to be honest with you, up until that point in my recovery, like, I could not see the point of a gratitude list at all. I was kind of going to bed at night, kind of writing things out to be grateful for, and just kind of like, box ticking stuff, but not really feeling it. And now I really, really try before I go to bed to just, even if just a couple of things, and to actually really feel it. I often kind of make it into more of a kind of like a meditation, if I'm honest with you, where I just kind of like sit there, really think about something in the day that's brought me a bit of joy or a little bit of light, and then really try and sort of meditate on it, really sort of feel the emotions around it, and really thank the universe or whatever it is you want to, um, for that gift. And you're actually getting evidence that your recovery is working. I mean, I don't know what I would have written down on my gratitude list had I been drinking. Do you know what I mean? It would have been stuff like, I'm really grateful that I threw up this morning, or I'm really grateful that the off license was still open. It would be a really sad kind of gratitude list. Um, so I think for me, that's the kind of key really, rather than kind of wallowing in the self pity and, what's the point in my life? I think recovery shows up and go, well, go and find it. And that's why people get into recovery and suddenly become CEOs, or they start nonprofits, or they become mum of the year, or, whatever it is, because that energy that we put into our active addiction, that doesn't just die, like that goes somewhere. Do you know what I mean? And so the people know it in these blue zones around the world. Blue zones are where people live, in a very high concentrated area of people that live past 100. Um, There's a place in Japan, I forget where it is now, and they swear by something called ikigai, which is basically this huge sense of purpose, and that's what recovery gives you, this drive. I think it was Anthony Hopkins that said his alcoholism didn't die, it just turned into this rage, and then it turned into this drive, which I think is brilliant, because I think the energy does have to go somewhere, and rather than wallowing in the self-pity, you start to get into the purpose and the passion and what you wanna do with the day. The third one I wanna talk about, the third lie around self-pity is others are better than you. Um, this is something that I used to really, really, really struggle with. Um, I'd sort of go on social media and sort of compare and despair, looking at everyone's highlight reel, which is essentially what social media is. And the old cliche, comparing my insides with other people's outsides. Um, and not everyone in recovery is on social media. Sometimes, you compare yourself to family members, or, it can happen anywhere. Um, and I think addiction knows that when we start to go away from the solution to our addiction, which is community coming together, this word we, when we start to compare, we're basically looking for what makes us separate and different. So we're going back into an I mentality, a kind of isolation mentality where addiction wants us. Um, Drinking for me at the beginning was all about going out, meeting people, socializing, but ended up with me in a dark room with a bottle. That's where it wants me. It wants me isolated, alone, feeling different and not part of anything. And so it loves this compare and despair thing, that, others are better than me. Um, and if we go back to that first word, we again, you know, it tells us straight away that this is probably a really awful thing to do. um, I just try and not compare myself to anybody. I think I was taught this very early on. You are going to do any kind of comparing. The best person to compare yourself is you yesterday. Are you doing better than you were yesterday? And I think that's probably quite useful. But in terms of what everyone else is up to, it's just a complete disaster and completely pointless, because, you know, I've never been driven by money, but it's quite an easy one to kind of quantify. Let's say that I always compared myself with people with more money, which would be a bit depressing to do, to be honest with you. And I kind of quantified that all my happiness would happen when I've got £1 million in my bank, right? And let's imagine that I was always comparing myself to a millionaire. And then finally, when I become a millionaire, I might be content for a hot minute, right? But I know within a matter of hours, if not days, I'm going to start comparing myself to someone that's got 2 million, and then it will be 3 million, and then it will be 5, and then it will be 10, and then it will be now I need to be a billionaire. Like, it will literally never stop, just like it was always the next drink. Let's get one more round in. It's always the next drink. It's always the next thing. It's never now. And so this compare and despair game is completely pointless. Again, another Anthony Hopkins quote. I don't know why I'm all over Anthony today. big up Anthony, is, he always wanted to be top of the tree. And when he got to the top of the tree, he'd never been more lonely. And I completely recognized that in myself. Like, by comparing myself to other people and trying to get to a place on the top of a tree or a hill or a podium, and then thinking that that is going to somehow cure my insides is a complete insanity. It's never, ever going to work. And so I had to completely and utterly stop doing that and realizing that there'll always be people in the world that seemingly have more. There'll always be some people that seemingly have less. I think it's just about finding acceptance about where you are on the journey and just having a real positive outlook that, like Yazoo and the plastic population said back in the 80s, the only way is up. In recovery, our life is on an upward trajectory. And one final thing I really want to say about self-pity, because I think it's quite important. I've never actually done this, but I think it would be a really healing thing, is if you got a bunch of people in early recovery to write down anonymously the one thing that they're most embarrassed about or ashamed about of something that they've done in active addiction, and then put them in a hat anonymously and then sort of dig them out, and then pull them out of a hat and read them out and said, who's done this? You probably find that 75%, 90% of the hands would all go up, and in that moment, it would be so healing. You'd go like, oh my God, I thought it was just me that did that. So again, finding a recovery community, you really start to understand that these things have played out in all of us, in people that you love and respect. One of my early mentors was 30 years sober, and I remember him telling me about some of the stuff he'd done in active addiction. It was worse than mine. Do you know what I mean? I was like, I can't believe this. So that was incredibly healing. And I think on a final point, particularly around lie 2, going back to life is shit, what's the point? I've really, really found as well, if this is very helpful for anyone, to just completely avoid the news, like first thing in the morning and last thing at night, because it really amplifies that lie for me, that life is terrible and what's the point? And we know that just before you go to bed and first thing in the morning is the part of the day where your brain is most neuroplastic. That is the time where whatever you put into the brain, it's going to be most malleable. It's going to affect it the most. So if the last thing at night you see is death, destruction, and war, you're going to basically ruminate on that all night, and then you can't figure out why you've woken up in a terrible mood. Similarly, in the morning, the first thing that you put into your brain in the morning has a huge impact on how your day then goes. So again, to sort of fill it with news first thing in the morning is a real act of self-harm, to be perfectly honest with you. And of course, I'm not saying like don't watch the news, but I mean, you're going to think I'm really sad now, right? So forgive this, but I really quite like, there's a moment in Good Morning Britain, oh my God, this is so sad, where they do like the newspaper review in the morning. I think it's at 6:30. So I record that and then watch that at like 6:00 in the evening. And there's a lot of science to kind of back this up, that whatever your, if you basically look at news later in the day, because your baseline level of happiness is higher because you haven't looked at it first thing in the morning, the way that you receive that bad news later on, you deal with much better. There's kind of been studies and tests on that. So it's not saying don't watch the news. It's just like, please don't do that first thing in the morning or last thing at night. That's probably a whole other podcast, but like my morning routine and evening routine really has to be, pretty clean for me to really kind of act and live optimally. But like I say, that's probably another whole podcast. The second area that I want to talk about today is fear. This episode is sponsored by Gavin Sisters, the passionate teetotal founders of the Detox Balm Retreat and the creators of Funky Coffee. If you love the taste of coffee but want to ditch the crash, Funky Coffee is your new go-to. Made from triple certified organic Arabica coffee and infused with powerful mushrooms, it gives you all the energy and none of the jitters. Plus, it's amazing for your gut, skin, and athletic performance. And if you're looking to recharge your body and mind, you've got to check out the Detox Barn. This award-winning retreat, located in both the UK and the Algarve, is a plant-based, alcohol-free sanctuary where you'll learn how to be healthier, happier, and more balanced. whether it's for a weekend away or a full restorative retreat. Just visit gavinsisters.co.uk and use the code School of Rock Bottom for 10% off your next retreat or a bag of their amazing funky coffee. That's School of Rock Bottom for a 10% discount for a healthier, happier you. Go check them out. Addiction loves to use fear as evidence that its lies are real. And I think with fear, there's basically just two lies. The first one is you're going to lose what you've got. So again, let's go back to our solution for self-pity, which is gratitude and community and coming together. So that's our solution for that. It will then hijack our gratitude and then use that as evidence of things that we're going to lose. So addiction's like, oh, great. So you're really grateful for your partner. She's going to lose you. She's going to leave you. Sorry. Addiction will say, oh, great. You're really grateful for your partner. She's going to leave you. Or you're really grateful for your work. Yeah, you're going to get fired, etc., etc., etc. So just as you're starting to get grateful and happy, it's then using that as evidence of stuff you're going to lose. So it's really like mucking around with your head here. And the second lie is you're not going to get what you want. So its whole game is you're going to lose what you have and you're not going to get what you want. And basically what that means is that you can't enjoy the present moment and you're constantly in fear, and drugs and alcohol always seem like such a great idea. But let's go back to the lie element for a minute and ask ourselves, is it actually true? Do we know that the things that we're worrying about are actually going to happen? And the answer is no. We have no evidence that those things are going to happen. Even if things are slightly on the rocks, we still don't know the full outcome. But what addiction likes to do is give you the worst case scenario. It likes to catastrophize. And hence why everyone always says in recovery, live in the day, because it's a kind of acknowledgement that as soon as we start to go into the future, i.e. imagination, it turns into disaster for a lot of us. Not everybody, but for a lot of people. As soon as they start going into the future, they start imagining illness, destruction, things going wrong. And again, that's then a great excuse to pick up a drink or pick up something else. But it's all imagination. And actually, if you think about it, everything that's happened in the past really is all imagination. It's kind of that old cliche. It's so true, but it's the power of now. All the power and everything that is happening is right now. So to kind of go into imagination about what may or may not happen is not only completely pointless, but it's also incredibly painful for us. One of my favorite quotes is from Mark Twain. I think he was asked, what does he want on his gravestone? And his answer was, I think it was something along the lines of, most of the things I worried about never actually happened, which I think is brilliant. And I think there's been a lot of studies on this, asking people that are critically ill who are near death's door if they've got any regrets. And I think the number one thing was, just worrying over stuff all the day, stuff that didn't matter. And also, if you think about it, spending a lot of time worrying about losing the things that you've got or worrying about things that you might not get. I mean, I call it the Ollie show. Like, I can only talk about myself, but all the stuff that I worry about around fear is all self-centered. It's all stuff about me. What people thought of me. Am I going to get this job? Like, what's the perception of me? They were the things that used to keep me up at night. Not the poor bugger that's, homeless outside Kentish Town tube station or wherever it is. It was all focused on me. And they say, don't they, the best way to get out of your head is to go and help somebody else. And it's so true. And that's why I love doing recovery work, because it's like, if I spend a day in a rehab working with people, helping them, like, I'm not worrying about my own fears. And I feel great because it's a break from what I call the Ollie show. It's absolutely exhausting. We know through studies as well that if somebody is having like a full-blown panic attack and they're really, really in a bad state, and then somebody next to them has a heart attack, they immediately stop having a panic attack and they go and help that person, which really shows the science behind that. That literally, when you're helping somebody else, you come out of your own fear, which I think is really hugely powerful, and something that, you know, a lot of us have cottoned onto in the recovery community, that by helping other people, you are really, really helping yourself. Now, the antidote to fear, Robin Williams used to say, was his lower power, which was alcohol. If you ask someone in recovery, you're going to find a lot of people will say that the antidote to fear is faith. You're going to hear that a lot. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky, because if you have a faith, then that's great, right? If you have a religious faith or a spiritual faith, then that might be very useful. You might think, okay, well, if I'm really, really fearful, what I can actually do is I can pray or meditate or whatever other tool you've got, and God of my understanding, whatever that is, will literally give me power in that moment to overcome that fear. Well, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant tool in your toolbox. But like, what about if you don't have faith in that? What about if you're an atheist? What about if you don't believe in any of that stuff? Um, well, I believe for those people, and again, if you're spiritual or religious, you can kind of use this in tandem with this. I believe that you can just simply put your faith in recovery itself. It is the one thing that will never ever let you down. Like, I've never heard anybody in recovery kind of say, when something goes wrong, oh shit, well, that wouldn't have happened if I was drinking. That wouldn't have happened if I was using Coke. Like, the one thing that has never let me down is my recovery. And you'll never wake up and regret not drinking the night before. No one ever wakes up in the morning and go, oh shit, I wish I had a hangover. Oh, you idiot. Should have drunk last night. Like, you always wake up and go, well, that was great. I'm so glad I did that yesterday. I want you to think about all of the consequences that you've come into recovery with, particularly those in early recovery listening to this. I bet nearly all of them are because of drugs and alcohol or other behaviors. I then want you to think about what you stand to lose if you go back to drugs and alcohol and those behaviors, right? So most people will say, well, I could lose my life. I could lose my job. I could lose money. I could lose my relationship. I could lose my family. Now, here's the thing. All of those things, if you're in recovery, become less likely to lose. In fact, you're not going to lose them at all. So there you are. You're in recovery. You're not using drugs and alcohol. You're full of fear. Addiction's telling you if you pick up a drug or a drink, it will make you feel better. The reality is, if you pick up a drug or a drink, you are going to lose those things. But if you put your faith in recovery, you're going to know that if you don't have a drug or a drink today, you cannot die from drugs and alcohol. You could die from something else, but you're not going to die from drugs and alcohol. You're going to know that it's going to make your relationship stronger. You're going to know that it's going to make you more likely to be able to pay your mortgage or your rent or look after your house if you're lucky enough to already own it. It's going to make your relationship stronger, your relationships with your kids stronger. I mean, I could go on and on and on. I mean, if you can't put your faith in that, then maybe I should just walk away now. Like, it's 100% bulletproof. And so I always say to my friends or people that are in recovery that really struggle with the spiritual side of stuff, or the God stuff, or the religious stuff. There is no religious stuff as far as I can see. That if you struggle with that, you can literally just put your faith in recovery itself. And I think it works on so many levels because, you might believe in karma. You know what I mean? So, that's a really obvious way. I'm just going to re-edit that bit. I don't think it matters what your belief system is, right? So, you might be Christian. You might believe it's reap what you sow. You might believe in science, and you might think, well, this is cause and effect. I'm doing a positive action, so therefore I'm getting more likely to get a positive outcome. You might believe in karma, and what goes around comes around. Like, I don't really think it matters what your belief system is. This works. And every day you're in recovery, you start to get more and more evidence that it works. But, life is a little bit like the S&P 500, the American stock market. It's not like a flat upward line that just gets better and better and better. Like, it has its ups and downs, but the overall trend is up. And every little time there's a perceived dip, you have a day that's a little bit rougher than the day before, addiction's right there, and it's like, "See, I told you recovery was rubbish. Told you. Useless. You may as well go back to drugs and alcohol." But if you just wait, if you just hold on in there and don't have a drug or a drink and get yourself to bed without a drug or a drink, you're gonna find that the next day you get a spike back up. I mean, that has happened to me so many times, where I've just been in so much fear in the past, and I'm thinking, "I can't get through this day without a drink." I've gone to bed, woken up the next day and gone, "I'm not even worried about that thing anymore." You know? I don't know if your grandma ever said to you, if you had a worry, just sleep on it. I mean, I used to think that was like an old wives' tale. Like, literally, your brain, when you're sleeping, it goes through so much deep emotional processing, and it sorts out all your problems from the day. And that's why in the morning you wake up feeling refreshed, and that thing that you were really worried about yesterday, you know exactly what to do today. Um, and it's really interesting how that mechanism works. And it works simply by letting your brain have a rest. But, when you're drinking or taking drugs, you just pass out. You don't properly sleep at all. And you don't have any of that deep REM sleep where you can do all that problem solving. And then in the morning, you don't wake up, you just come to, and the problems are still there. The fear is still there. And now it's even worse because you've got the hangover to deal with. So guess what? You're now going to go back to the off license, to the dealer, whatever it is, and you're just going to go round and round and round and round. And the fear gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So every single day is an act of faith in recovery. And after a while, it just becomes completely and utterly, like, it just makes absolute sense. Um, Faith for some people is a really big word, and I have huge respect for people that believe in that way, or have faith in that way, if you like. But for some people, faith is literally this simple. Is it possible that if I get to bed tonight without a drug or a drink, that tomorrow things could look brighter? I think it can literally be that simple. And giving yourself that opportunity to see, and again, every day in recovery, you get more and more evidence that actually, yes, you know, things are working out. And so that learning disorder that addiction is starts to get reversed. It goes from, everything I do always turns to shit, nothing works out, to then suddenly, wow, if I just hang on in there and keep in recovery, things always find a way to work itself out. And even when doors have closed on me in recovery and I've been really angry, like, I really wanted to walk through that door, recovery always shows up and goes, well, now you're going to go down a different path. And then I'm walking down it and I'm like, oh, I actually like this way better, you know? So I have complete faith in recovery today. And I do think that comes with time. And so I just encourage you just to hang on in there, and that faith really, really will come. The last lie I want to talk about is around anger. Okay. Now, this is a very, very simple one. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm talking about anger and not resentment. Okay. So resentment literally means to re-feel. So resentments are kind of historical anger. This is things that could be going back years. Now, that is obviously a very sensitive thing. That's another whole podcast. Um, I certainly can't in the next 5 minutes kind of tackle in any meaningful way resentments. That's probably something that you might do, for example, with a therapist, and go into a lot of detail about. But what I can talk about very quickly, and even in 5 minutes, is kind of anger that happens in the moment. Things that just kind of piss you off as you're going. And I think there's only one lie when it comes to anger that I've found anyway. And it's this: people, places, and things aren't doing what they bloody well should be doing. I'll repeat that. People, places, and things aren't doing what they bloody well should be doing. Now, this is where addiction is really sneaky, right? Because on one hand, earlier on with self-pity, It's saying, you're a piece of shit and you don't deserve recovery, but you are God. And everything and everyone should be doing exactly as you want it to. So it kind of goes back to that thing that I've spoken of before in previous episodes, this idea that I've got this huge ego, but this cripplingly low self-esteem, and then you've got this gap. And that's where behaviors, drugs, alcohol for a lot of people kind of go in. And then you stuff it to try and fill it up. And then when you take it away, the hole has just got bigger. And I think it really goes back to this, this sort of low self-esteem that I'm not good enough, but then this other belief that everybody should be doing exactly as I want. And this illusion that I'm God, if you like, and that I have control over people, places, and things drives me nuts because it's not true. Because the only person that I can control in recovery, that is, without drugs and alcohol and behaviors, is myself. And I used to have it completely back to front. I wanted to be out of control, but I wanted to control you. And now I've got no desire whatsoever to control anybody else. But I do like to be in control of myself, and I think, it's really, really interesting because I think empathy is such a great conduit to kind of understand this. Um, when they say if you feel angry, you should count to 10. One way that I've always done that is just to simply ask myself the question, have I ever done it? That immediately calms me down. There's a great saying in recovery, isn't there? Restraint of pen and tongue, which is something that I've always lived by in the last 9 years. So if I'm really, really angry, that's when, I sit on it until the next day. I've even drafted emails that never got sent. I mean, just a quick tip, and never put the email address at the top, just in case you send it. And then the next morning you'll look at it and you'll read it and go, oh my God, thank God I didn't send that, And I think that's really, really good. If you're really angry, if you can, definitely delay until the next day. But I think the real way out of this for me has been understanding that it's never personal. I used to go into Tesco, and I'd buy a pint of milk. And if I'd turn around to the cashier and say, you have a great afternoon, if they didn't say it back, if they sort of ignored me and sassed me and were a bit rude, I'd be really angry, really, really upset. But now my first thought is, I hope that person's okay. Because if that person was in a really good mood, they'd say, hey, you have a great afternoon as well. But my addiction says it's personal, but it's not personal. She might have a migraine, or he might have just split up with his wife, or he might be ill, or he might have just had an argument with his boss, but none of it has got anything to do with me. And I'm just going to finish on this. This is something that happened to me in relatively early recovery. I had a friend that had moved to Australia, and I'd not seen him for a couple of years, and he was back in London, and he rung me out of the blue, and he said, hi, Ollie, I'm back in London. And I said, hello, mate, how you doing? He said, hang on a second, I've got another call, I'll just ring you back. Well, he never rang me back. Didn't hear a word from him. A day passed, went on Facebook, could see that he'd been out for a Chinese with his cousin. I was absolutely fuming, right? Another day passed. He still hadn't rung me back. I was even more angry at this point. I thought, how dare he not ring me back? What's going on here? And someone suggested to me, why don't you ring him? I said, well, I'm not going to ring him. He said he'd ring me back, right? So I rang up my recovery mentor at the time, and he said, have you written it down? And this is something that we learn to do in particular recovery communities. You write down who you're angry with, you write down what they did, and then you look at your part in it, right? And so for me, the first thing was pride. How dare he not ring me back? It was preventing me ringing him and sorting it out. But the second thing that I noticed was as well is that it was fear. Why doesn't he love me anymore? Why am I not good enough? Why doesn't he respect me? Why doesn't he love me? And that's the bit that I would never admit in the pub. And for me, when I've got pride and fear mixed together, it's like this horrible cocktail for relapse. And then I spoke to my friend, and he said, well, is it personal? I said, well, of course it's personal. He didn't ring me back. And then a few hours later, I swear this is true, he rung me back. And he said, oh, sorry, I didn't ring you back the other day, mate. I was like, that's all right, mate. I totally forgot about it. Like Pinocchio knows, for those that are listening. Complete rubbish. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't ring you back, mate." He said, "I'm back in London." He said, "My gran is really, really ill. She's got terminal cancer. She's only got a week to live, and I've been all over the place. Is it all right if we meet up?" And I got to be honest with you, I was physically sick after that phone call because I'd again made it the Ollie show. I'd made it all about me, and it had absolutely nothing to do with me. And from that day, I made a promise that anytime I got angry, I was going to write it down in exactly the same way. So who I'm angry with, what they did, what my part in it was. If you want more details on that, that's probably another whole podcast. But then the last column, was it personal? I have yet to write down yet, every time I've been angry, that it's been personal. It's always been other people's stuff, and it's such a relief to know that the world isn't obsessed with me. Only I'm obsessed with me. It's never anything to do with me. And actually, by giving away control, you've got it. And that doesn't mean that I don't show up. That doesn't mean that I don't try really, really hard. It doesn't mean that I'm not really passionate about what I do. It just means that ultimately the outcome is kind of out of my hands, and sort of recognizing that. And that just allows me to live life like a loose overcoat, or, not take life quite so seriously. Anyway, there's a few little ideas that I thought I'd share with you today. I'm about to get kicked out of this lovely podcast studio, so I'll wrap it up. But I will be back in 2 weeks' time as promised. I'd like to give a last shout out to sponsors, which is the amazing Gavin Sisters. Head to the show notes now for 10% off. And as I've always promised, and I've not let you down yet, I will see you in 2 weeks' time for a brand new episode with a special guest. Until then, look after yourself, and thanks for watching or listening.